Hey, welcome. So today we're going to discuss Blazor WASM and Azure Static Web Apps. Great combination with Johan. So thank you for coming and speaking to us today. I've
You're welcome.
just got a few housekeeping calls to do. So this session is just being recorded on behalf of the Azure Cloud Commanders Learning Room. So if you do not consent to being part of a recorded session, please disconnect your line. The attendees' names are hidden. However, this is a recording, so if you do come off mute or have your camera on, just be aware that the voice in the video will be recorded along with anything that you say. And just some inclusive session guidelines as well. This is like we're open for anyone to come and view, participate in. For some people, you might be hearing about this technology for the first time today. For the others, you might have used it day to day. So, yeah, no questions, bad questions. If you have questions, put in the chat. We'll get to them. But yeah, just come enjoy and yeah, be welcoming to anyone who comes and asks questions. We're all here to learn, right? So I'd just like to introduce our speaker today, which is Johan, who's a Microsoft MVP in .NET DevOps and a Microsoft certified trainer. So thank you very much for joining us today and delivering and all your knowledge on static web apps and WASM and how they can work together. I'm really looking forward to it. So yeah, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's start with a thing that I'll simply start sharing my screen. Hope that this works. Always. Come on.
We have the technology. Come on. Yeah.
Yeah, that's always the good. Let's share this one. And yes, push you to the side. I am working on multiple monitors, so yes, you should be able to see it, and I'll simply put it in present mode, then it's easier. Okay, welcome. Are you ready? Saw this one? Well, if you want to get in touch, we will get some information as well at the end. Okay, and what are we going to cover? We're going to dive a bit into what Azure Static Web Apps are all about. And most of this talk will be spent in code in Azure because I am a developer. I love seeing code. I love seeing Azure, and I don't like seeing so much PowerPoint. So we are not going to spend that much time in PowerPoint. Okay. But before we dive into the static web apps, let's start with a bit of history, because if you look at where we came from, and yes, I've been in the industry for quite some time, even when HTML and the web was getting a bit more popular. So in the beginning, we had HTML, we had a web server, and we had a computer, and all the computer did was simply go to the web server and fetch the HTML. Okay. The web server didn't have to do a lot, simply respond to HTTP requests and deliver the HTML. Okay, things got a bit more complicated because we added JavaScript, we added CSS, but still for the web server, it was the same. It was static content being delivered through the HTTP to a client. Okay, things got a bit different because, and that has been quite some time, we started working with server-side web development, like ASP.NET. And then things started to change a bit for the web server, because let's be honest, if I want to run ASP.NET or any other SDK on a web server, I do need a lot of runtime components. So we did end up with a more beefy web server. Okay, and if we translate this and put this situation into Azure, you probably will end up with an app service or a container app with the web application in it so that the clients can communicate. Okay, that works quite nicely if you have the desire for a server-side web application. But what is the current situation? Some web applications are built as a single page application. And I deliberately say some web applications because not every web application is suitable to be a single page web application, nor should it be. But if you look at a spa, what does it need? It does need a web server. But if you look at what comprises of a spa, it's actually HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, because the better known spa frameworks are all JavaScript frameworks or TypeScript, but well, that's simply transpiled into JavaScript anyway. So if you look at it, what the web server has to do is combine these and send them to the spa. Okay, so there's not a lot that the web server has to do. Okay, now we add Blazor to this equation. Blazor, of course, is also a single page web application framework, which will allow us to write C# in combination with HTML, at least Razor, CSS, and still a bit of JavaScript, because let's be honest, sometimes you simply need JavaScript to run. But if you look at Blazor, Blazor comes in a few flavors. I can use Blazor in a server-side setting where Blazor will run on the server and simply use Signal R to communicate all the changes to the browser. Okay, that doesn't change a lot. But what if I use the WebAssembly version of Blazor? Well, if you look at it, for the browser, WebAssembly is simply transferred to the browser and interpreted on the browser. So if you look at what the web server has to do for a single page web application framework, we're back to where we started out with, a relatively simple web server that simply has to produce static content. But what if I want to host this setup in Azure? Of course, I could say I'm going to push this to an app service. I could even put it in a container. But if you consider it as pay-as-you-go, is this really necessary? Because an app service is a bit over the top for the requirements that you have. Well, Microsoft also recognized this, and that's why we do have Azure Static Web Apps. Static Web Apps are all around hosting static web applications in a global and scalable solution. So all your web application can consist of is HTML, JavaScript, CSS, images, WASM, video, all the standard stuff without any running components on the server. Of course, we don't right-click deploy anymore, do we? Yes, sometimes we do, of course, but it's good to have a CI/CD integration. Well, Azure Static Web Apps, and I will show you that, does have that out of the box. There's integration with an API, because a lot of web applications do need some information from a backend server. There's authentication, authorization, because we do live in a bad, scary world where people will try to enter your application. So authentication and authorization is important. I can put up custom domains. I can use SSL, fortunately. And one of the good things is there's an automatic staging environment. Well, some of the things that I have just told you will simply show in a code demo. So enough PowerPoint, at least for the next few minutes. And let's simply dive into code and let's switch to some code. Okay. I started up Visual Studio. And for those who are very familiar with C# and .NET, Visual Studio is probably the environment that you use for a lot of projects. You can do everything that I show you also in Visual Studio Code. There's one specific reason why I chose Visual Studio for this demo, is because I do have some code snippets that I can use simply to speed up the typing so that you don't have to watch me hit the backspace button over and over again, because like a lot of developers, I'm very bad at typing, especially when people are watching. Okay, so what am I going to start out with? Well, simply I'm going to create a new project. And of course, just have to wait a bit. Visual Studio is sometimes a bit slow, and I'll simply start looking for Blazor. Well, if you are familiar with Blazor, you probably will understand all the different components here. But looking back at the talk that I gave, I am interested here in the WebAssembly standalone app, because the web app will or can use server-side components. The server app will use them. So if I'm going to push them to an Azure Static Web App, I do need the WebAssembly standalone version. Okay, and I'll simply go through all the options. Okay, for the project name, I am going to use the name client. And I will show you later on why I chose client. Demo, I'll simply push this one in. Okay, give me next. And we'll go for .NET 9. And not that it's not important, but just for this demo, I'm going to leave out authentication. By the end of the talk, I will show you authentication and what you need to do for it. But for the demo, I will simply leave it out. What I will do is include the sample pages, because that's quite important to have. Okay, and now I'll simply hit create and let Visual Studio create the project for me. Okay. If you're not that familiar with Blazor, Blazor is set up in a number of folders. And what you will see is in the default template, I will have some Razor files, which are my pages. And that will mean that I have a combination of HTML and code all set up within one file. And I always, if I have the default pages, I always have 3 pages, one home page, one page that simply contains a button to increase a counter, and one to show weather information. And what will this look like if I run this? Well, it's not very difficult. It's quite a basic application, but we do have to wait a bit, of course, until the application is built. Things will speed up afterwards, fortunately. And we only have a small group, so I don't mind if you have any questions. You can always ask them in between. And I'll simply open up, maximize this one so I can hope that I can see everything. Okay. It's taking a bit longer. Yes, there is my console. So now it will probably pop up anytime. Just wait for it. Okay, launching debug adapter. Almost there. Yes, and it's coming up in my next screen. So what you will see after it's loaded are simply 3 pages with some navigation on the left-hand side. Okay. Okay, let's show it. Okay, perfect. So here's my homepage. Here's my counter, where you can see the counter increment, and here's my weather information. And one thing that I didn't mention to you, the weather information doesn't come from any backend service. It comes from my www root. There's some sample data in here with some JSON. And this is all the temperature information that is shown. Okay, what I want to do in this talk, I want to get this application to run as a Azure Static Web Application. Okay, so what do we need to do for that? Well, I did mention that we do have a continuous integration, continuous deployment. But of course, before I can start using that, I should push this, of course, to Git. Okay, what I'm going to do, I'm going to choose an MIT license, going to push the repo cc demo, and I'll even put it to public, so you can always refer it back to it. And I'll simply say visibility. No, I want visibility public. Okay, create and push. Nothing special, simply pushing it to GitHub. And if I go to my browser, then I hope if I go to my GitHub and I refresh, that's not there yet. Just wait, give it a sec. It's pushing, committing. Yes, it should be there. $162 looks promising. Yes, here's our CC demo. Perfect. Okay, I've got my code on GitHub. Now I really would love it to be included as an Azure Static Web App. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to head to the portal. Yes, you can do this through a command line interface, but just to show you, I think it's easier to use it in a visual way so that you can see all the options that are available to you. Okay, so I'm simply going to create a resource, and I'm going here for a static web app. And you will see that there will come some templates. And the first one should be the static web app. And I'll simply say, well, I want to create this one. Okay, wait for the template to show up. And now we are simply here in the template for the create static web app. What I'm going to do is I am going to select my resource group, simply push it to a specific one that I created for this session. Here you can see that it's a global solution. So you have a global distribution to it. Okay, I'll simply call this one CC demo, and now I have to choose a plan. And if you look at it, you can choose here 2 plans, but actually there are 3. The free plan, the standard plan, and the dedicated preview one. Well, the free plan is just as it's called free. Standard, you do pay for it, not a whole lot, but you still do pay for it. And dedicated, it's in preview. I don't know what the prices will be for that one. I must say I haven't played with that one. But if you look at the features per plan, you can see that the free and the standard do not differ that much, because if I look at bandwidth, it's the same. If I look at custom domains, well, okay, I've got 2 for the free and 5 for the paid one. I get certificates free. Okay, if I want to do something with custom authentication, then I do need a paid plan. If I want private endpoints, I do need it. Okay, if I have a very large app, it won't fit in the free plan. I do have 3 staging environments minimum compared to 10. And I have Azure Functions, only managed or bring your own. Okay, you can do a lot with an Azure Static Web App in the free plan. And here it says for hobby or personal projects. I also do some charity work for some charity organizations. And yes, I even use Azure for that. And sometimes I use a static web app in the free setup, simply because you can do a lot with it for free. So you can make a very good solution within Azure, especially if you combine it, for instance, with Cosmos DB. And if you choose the right options there, you don't pay anything. So you can really host a very good web application running on Azure for almost free. Okay, for this demo, at least for the first part of it, I'm going to use the free plan, simply to show you that you can do a lot with the free plan. Okay, and now comes the CI part, because I do have to tell where are my sources. Well, they're on GitHub, and I can select my organization, and I can select my repository, and I can select my branch. Now comes the beautiful part of it. Of course, this talk is all around getting a Blazor WebAssembly to an Azure Static Web App. But if I look at this drop-down list, and I already told you in the presentation, of course, a lot of Spark frameworks are based on JavaScript, and you see actually all the well-known JavaScript frameworks like Angular, like Next, like Nuxt, like Vue, Svelte, React. You see all those available. So like everything in Azure, it's not limited to C#.NET only. You can do a lot with other frameworks as well. Okay. I do have to set up some things. And here you see why I chose my project to be called client, because that's the default app location in the template. If I choose a different project name, it's just fine, but I now have to update this one. Okay, I didn't put in an API yet, so I will leave that one out. And my output location will be my www root. Okay, and now if I go to deployment, yes, simply use the deployment token. One of the things that got changed over the past few months is the backend will be by default an Azure function. And beforehand, you couldn't choose where that was hosted. Nowadays, you can make a choice, where do you want your Azure Functions API to be? Well, and since I live in the Netherlands, Western Europe is probably the best option for me. If you live down under, you probably, I think that East Asia is probably the best one if you are based in Australia, New Zealand, things like that. But you can always play with it. Well, there's also edge computing. I'm not going to touch that in this talk. Well, I'm not going to add any tags. And so now I can simply review and create it. Perfect. Simply let Azure do its thing. And what we will see is we have our portal. It's created. I simply say go to resource. And I say, well, okay, I want my URL to open. But this does not look that much like my Blazor application, right? That looked quite different. Why is that? That's not a lot of magic. But if you look at your code, you will see that Azure did generate a GitHub action for you. So there's an Azure Static Web Apps workflow, and simply in YAML. And what you can see is the triggers are on a push to main or pull requests to main. And you will see that the CI/CD is combined into a build and deploy job. And you don't see any .NET build things like that because it's using a special task for the static web apps. But what you can see here is all the things that we set up in the portal. So my app location is here, the default API location is left alone, and my output location is my WW root. So if there's an action, I should check if there's an action running. And yes, there is. So let's see how far this has come already. So we'll simply open it up, see where it is, and it is already publishing. I think that we have to wait a bit because finish uploading. It's pulling on deployment, so this normally takes a few seconds for it to deploy. So we do wait for it to prevent some context switches. 15 seconds. Normally it takes about 2 to 3 steps, so I do expect it to be online quite soon. That's the downside of, yes, there it is. And there is my site. So my Blazor WebAssembly app running entirely in Azure. But I'm not content yet, because I really would love to show you how you can integrate a static web app with an API, because there's a default option for it, so why not use it? Okay, let's start doing that. But that will mean that if I go to Solution Explorer, before I do anything else, I should get my Git changes, and I'll simply pull the changes because, of course, the workflow file is part of my repo as well. And if I don't update it, I probably will get some issues, and I don't want that. And I'll simply put you to hide because I do want the Solution Explorer to be visible at all times. Perfect. Okay. Before I add the application, there's one thing that I want to do, and I'm going to add a configuration file. And that configuration file is going to call staticwebapp.config.json. And what this file will do, it will give me a navigational fallback. So it's simply a setting that you can push into a static web app, and if the navigation fails, that it will redirect to my index.html, which is the starting point of a Blazor WebAssembly application anyway, just to make sure that things work. Okay, I want an API. And as you saw with the plans, if I go for a basic plan, the free plan, I will have to go for an Azure function. And yes, you can see it's in my recent project templates, but I wanted to go through this one. Okay, so my Azure functions, click next. I am going to call this one API and put it in the same folder. And of course, if it pops up, we are going to use .NET 9. And if you're not that familiar with Azure Functions are actually serverless functions that can be executed in Azure when they receive a trigger. And there's a lot of triggers that you can use for an Azure function. But if you look at it from a network perspective, of course, if I've got a web application with WebAssembly and I want to make a call to an external API, I probably will have to do that through HTTP. So it's quite nice that there are things like MySQL bindings and Dapper bindings, event grids, but you're not going to use it. Simply go for HTTP. We could go for .NET Aspire, but we're not going to do that in this session. So we'll simply leave that alone, and I will put this one to anonymous because I don't want any authentication to be part of the demo at the moment. Okay, simply hit create. This does take a bit shorter than the other one. Okay, so what do I've got? I've got an Azure function, and simply wait until Visual Studio has resolved all the, all the usings are now resolved. So I have an Azure function and I've got a program, and that's not too much. It simply will configure a builder and build it. Okay. But now I want this API to return the weather information that is part of this sample data weather JSON. And we do already have some kind of class because there's the weather forecast information that is being used in Blazor to actually read the JSON information and to produce it. Well, okay, what I'm going to do is I could copy the one. I'm not going to do that. I'll simply say I am going to create a weather forecast. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace this with some code. So my weather forecast with the date, the temperature in centigrade, a summary, and some temperature in Fahrenheit. Okay. And what I want is my function. I want my function to return some random temperatures, not the default list, just some random temperatures. Well, there's a downside to it, because if I look at my JSON, you will see that the summary is now hard-coded based on the temperature, and it's simply in the JSON file. I don't want that. So I do need a helper function. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce a helper function to generate the summary based on the temperature. And I'll simply choose some random boundaries when people will think it's hot, cold, or freezing. And what I have to do in my function is actually replace this one. Just going through some usings that I have to fix. So all I have to do is I still have my HTTP trigger. It's still anonymous. It will use the get verb. And what it will simply do, it will return 5 random weather forecasts. Okay. And just to make sure that I don't mess up, I simply run this one to check what will happen. And just wait. Don't worry. You will notice this is, of course, a session that's being recorded. I also always notice a delay in Visual Studio when I am streaming through Teams. So in reality, Visual Studio is way faster. So if you're using Visual Studio Code, for instance, you will see a slowdown as well. But Teams will slow down a machine a lot. So that's why it's taking a bit longer than I would do this in reality. Okay, what you see is my Azure function boots up. I'll simply say, well, I want to open it up. And what I will see is I do have, if I wait a bit, I will see my 5 random temperatures, right? Okay, perfect. Okay, there was some support for an API. So what I will do is simply say, well, I am going to my GitHub Actions file. And I'm going to switch. And go to folder view. And go to my GitHub, get to my workflow. Because I want to say, well, you know what? I have got my API in place. Okay, perfect. And then I go to Git changes. And I see all my changes that I have made. Quite happy with them. So, okay. Yeah, I will do it. This is not a talk about GitHub Copilot. And we're not going to talk about it that much. There are lots of other sessions with it. Sometimes it's nice to generate a message with it. Sometimes it gives quite a good commit message and sometimes it doesn't. But okay, I'm happy with it. Simply accept it and commit all and push. Okay, what will happen now? Of course, I still have that action. So if I go back to my GitHub repo and browse a bit, and I go to the Actions tab and click on it and just wait, we will see that the action is actually running. Perfect. This is ready. That's not what I think. Let's simply refresh it because it can't be that fast. Ah, that's better. Okay. This is the downside, of course, what you see if you use a pure server-side function or server-side web application, that the interface doesn't get updated automatically. Okay, this will build and deploy. Okay, but in the meantime, we're not going to wait for that because I want to see what will happen if I simply want to run this on my local machine. So I'm going to open up the solution again. And what I want to do is run the client and the API at the same time. Okay. And I don't know if you know it, but there has been a small change. A few versions back from Visual Studio, you could simply select multiple starter projects. Nowadays, there are launch profiles. And what I'm going to do is simply call this one API and client. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start up my client and my API. And yes, I want to change it. Okay. And what I'm going to do is simply run the API and client. Because, oh, that's not what I can do. Because there is something that I need to change. Because, of course, I need to change the location of this one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, the API is going to be called for the weather forecast. Because if you look at an Azure Static Web App, the API is an integral part of the Azure Static Web App. So the Azure function is not separated. So I only separate it by API. So this should work on Azure. And what, of course, I didn't do, so I am going to update that now, is simply push this information into Azure as well. So I simply change URL because I simply forgot, and I commit all and push. Okay. And to speed up things, what I'm going to do is I will say that I am, if I go to Actions, yes, if I go to Actions, Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cancel this one because this is not going to do what I want. And so I do have to change URL that is going to work. Okay, if I now run this, what will happen? I just told you that the API is an integral part of an Azure Static Web App. But does that also apply on my local machine? Not quite sure. Let's look. So it's going to build it. It's going to run it. My local functions are simply drag it inside your view so that you can see what's going on. And the secrets file, yeah, great. Just wait. Okay. My Blazor application is coming about. And okay, the weather forecast. Okay, the service is running. My Blazor application is coming. And what will happen when I click the weather tab? I will get an error. But I just told you that the Azure function is an integral part of the static web app, right? That's true. But that only applies on Azure. If you do this on your local machine, you're not getting away with simply pushing an Azure function project next to your WebAssembly project and think it will all work. Because for Visual Studio, these are simply two different processes that run on your machine. And I'm not quite sure about you, but I really love to be able to debug all the things that I do locally before I push them to the cloud. Okay, what should I do to get that to work? Well, for starters, I do need to set course, the cross-origin resource sharing. And what I want to do in my Azure Functions, there's always a local settings JSON, and that only applies to your local machine. So if I want a course settings that is only applicable for my local machine, I should put it in the local settings JSON. Okay, perfect. So that will take away all kinds of course problems. But my client does need to know where to find the API, or at least when I'm running it on my local machine. Okay, what can I do? If I go to my WW root, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new item, and all I'm going to do is simply adding my app settings.development.json. Okay. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the settings here. An API prefix, and it's simply a thing that I called API prefix. You can name it whatever you like. But what I do need to do is I do need to make sure that my port setting is good. And that's quite strange, 1729. That's really by accident that the same port gets generated by Visual Studio as the one that I recorded before. Okay, but it's not a problem. It's going to run on 1729. And what I do need to do, of course, I do need to tell my builder, my HTTP client, that it could use a different URL if we are running locally. Well, what the fortunate thing is, I can simply use the existence of API prefix as one of the switches. So I can say, well, if it's there, then use that one. And otherwise, you will see that the host environment, the base address is being used so that the address of the Azure Static Web App is used. Okay, perfect. If I now have done everything right, then this should work as well on my local machine. Just wait. The function is coming along. Just wait for the Blazor application to come along. There it is. And wait for it to display. It's loading, perfect. Almost there. It's just a genuine progress bar. 100% doesn't mean that you're there. And it's loading. And you will see here that my weather forecast is actually being executed, so that this information is being retrieved from the server. Okay, let's go back to this one. Because does this mean that this works also for this one? Well, let's see. I go to my loading and I'll see it's loading. Takes a bit of time. Okay. Let's see what happens, because I always don't like black boxes. So what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to refresh the page with the developer tools in it and see what will happen. Okay, and what do I see? I have here my weather forecast, and you will see that it actually is fetching the Azure function through API weather forecast. So that would mean that if I replace this one with API weather forecast, you will see that 5 temperatures gets generated. So that will mean that if I know the API that's being called, and I don't do anything about security, then everyone that is able to do something with HTTP can call my API. We'll come to that at the end of the talk, because that's of course not a thing that you really would love to do. Okay. One thing that's probably good to show you, if we go back to Azure, and if I go to my recent resources, you do see here my CC demo as a static web app. That's a bit strange because I don't see my Azure function. So if I go to my resource, and if I go to my APIs, you will see that I do have my function app. It's managed. So that does mean that there's no separate resource that is shown in the Azure portal. So everything you see is your static web app, and the function is an integral part of it. Unless, of course, you bring your own function in the other plan, then you can see it. But by default, in the Azure portal, you only see the Azure Static Web App, and you don't see the Azure function. Okay, nice. So we already saw a lot. We have CI/CD. I have an API attached to it. I can easily host an Azure Static Web App or use Blazor WebAssembly to be hosted as an Azure Static Web App. Still not there yet, at least not what I want to show you. Because I don't know how about you, but I always have customers, and customers that have all kinds of demands. And my customer comes to me and he says, well, Johan, quite nice, but on the homepage, there is Hello World, and I don't want that. I want it to be Hello Cloud Commanders. Okay, so what I'll do, I'll simply create a new branch and I'll say change title. And what I'm going to do, did I make changes? Let's look. Oh, the development JSON, then the program. Okay, just for debugging. Okay, and simply push them all. Perfect. Not a problem at all. And because now I should be able to create a new branch. You see, ready, pushed, create a new branch, and I want it to do change title. Okay, create branch. And I'm going to change this one, commanders, perfect. Client really happy. Update the title. Well, shall I do it? Shall I show you? Yeah, let's simply do it. Because I do want to show you. I know we have a mixed audience, and never, ever, ever commit something to Git that you haven't tested on your local machine before you start committing, because that's bad. That's really bad practice. So I'm not going to show you that in a demo as well. I know it will work, but you shouldn't do it.
I
Okay.
was just remarking in the chat about how you're actually creating the branch instead of committing directly. So plus, good one. Yeah.
Yeah, and because I want to show you something that's quite a nice feature for the Azure Static Web Apps, and that really needs a branch. And really, even if I work on projects on my own, I always use feature branches. I won't say I never commit directly to main, but I do try to limit that one. And if it happens, it's more like in my flow, I forgot to create a separate branch for a very small thing that I have to change. But normally I always work with feature branches to keep things separated, because you never know when you're going to mess up. But I've been in the industry for almost 30 years. There's one constant factor: I will always mess up sometimes. Even sometime during the week, I will do stupid things, and then I'm quite glad that I have got my feature branches that I can simply undo. But we will see. Hey, I've got my Hello Cloud commanders. Perfect. So what will happen if I push this one to my GitHub? Okay, let's go. Let's go to see what will happen. So I am going to my change URL. Oh, it's already there. Simply refresh. Just for debugging is running. But I did push something to Git, right? Yes, but if you remember correctly, if I go to my Git workflow, and if I show you the trigger, it will only work on a push to main, which I didn't do, or a pull request to main. Well, of course, this is also good practice. If you have a feature branch, you simply will put a pull request in it. So I'm going to compare it and start a pull request. And it's not a lot that I have to do. Yeah, I'm not going to ask Copilot to review it for me. I'm simply going to create a pull request. Okay. And now a beautiful thing will happen. You will see that the GitHub action gets triggered. That's not that specific because, let's be honest, we saw that already when we start pushing to main. Okay. Let it run a bit. Because it's, let's see if I am going to wait for it. Giving the time, no. What we'll do is we'll simply let this run in the background, because what I want to do with you is also look at some of the settings that you can do for your static web app. And before I'm going to do that, let's double check where my build is at the moment. Publishing to directory. Okay, well, that's just fine. Doesn't matter much. Okay, what can we see? Because I'm going to switch plans in a bit. But I don't know how familiar you are with, for instance, IIS, the Internet Information Server. Well, when I started working with .NET almost 20 years ago, or even more than 20 years ago, I had to do a lot of things on IIS myself. And for instance, I can start using routes. I can simply rewrite, I can redirect, I can use status code. So there's a lot of things that I can do on an Azure Static Web App, which I normally would do with IIS. There's a configuration, but it says, okay, it has been moved to environment variables, just like all the other things in Azure. Sometimes you do need to inject HTML in every request. And yes, of course, you could do that in your own application, but it's quite nice that an Azure Static Web App can do that for you, at least if the snippets load. Just give it a few seconds.
Just a comment on those routes. So the routes that you can see there, is that essentially the same thing as the static web app JSON file where you can configure the routes to go, hey, go here, like go to the route for 443? Like, is it exactly the same as
Without being 100% sure, I think yes, because what you can do in the portal, you can do with JSON files as well.
I've only ever done it through the JSON file, so it was, yeah, interesting to see the UI component. So yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, that's why I love showing it in the Azure portal. The Azure portal is a bit more slow, but it gives you a far better visual feeling of what can be set.
Yeah.
Okay, now my snippets have loaded, at least. Azure is not that fast at the moment. I'm not quite sure why, but okay. But now you can see, okay, where do I want, for instance, a snippet to be, in the head or in the body? I can name it. I can say, well, what do I want for the insert location, and for which environment would I love it to be? Well, for all, for the preview, for just specific. Okay, not going to push any snippets in here now, but no, sometimes it can be quite easy, and especially if you are using beta versions, that you can actually push in a snippet that you can always make sure that you see in the HTTP response that it's coming from a beta version. Well, environment variables, just as you are quite familiar with in other Azure resources. App Insights I can use. I can use my custom domains if I want to, so I can simply add one from Azure. I can even use, of course, fortunately, domains that I have bought somewhere else and attach it to Azure. Okay, already covered the API section. One of the things that I haven't played around with, but it's still in preview, but I'm quite curious on what it will do, is the database connection, because that will allow you to attach a database directly to your Azure Static Web App without having to write my custom API. And there's environments. Yes, this is what I was waiting for. Because you will see that I have two environments here. Production. Hey, and there's someone here. Number 1 updated title. Okay, perfect. Let's head back to my GitHub. Deploy complete. Visit your site at. Let's click on this one. And what we will see is hello Cloud Commanders. But if I go back to my Meadow, and if I go back to the weather, and just wait a bit for the home, I have hello world. So what is the quite nice thing about it? If you do a pull request, you get a staging environment out of the box. And I'm not quite sure about you, but when I do a code review, I not only want to review the code, but I also want to check that, especially for web applications, that the thing actually works. So I want to really start the application. And yes, of course, I can do that by pulling all the sources to my local machine and having it run there. But it's great if I can get that to be done in my CI/CD during a pull request, because that will also allow me, for instance, to run automatic tests with Playwright against my Blazor web application, so that I can make sure that everything works. And that means that when I actually say, well, I'm going to approve this pull request, that I'm quite sure that I'm not only approving the code change that I see, but I also approve all the functionality that I see. So that's a very important thing that you get out of the box. Okay, we're going to switch back to the Azure portal because we weren't there yet. Okay, role management, of course, who can do what? Simply from Azure, one of the nicest things that you can do, and I'm not going to show you it in code because we simply don't have the time for it, is the authentication part. Because even in the free plan, if I go for a simple authentication, I can hook it up with Entra by simply implementing 2 pages. And of course, configure my Entra ID in my own Azure environment. And that will mean that everything will work out of the box. And what is the beauty as well, this will also forward to my API. So what I showed you, that I can go to my API unauthenticated. If I hook this one up, I can make sure that my API doesn't get called directly anymore if there is no logged in user. Which personally, as a developer with a security mind, I really love, because as easy as it was for me to simply go to the network tools and see which API got called, sometimes I do that with production applications as well, even ones that I don't own, simply to check what's going on behind the scenes. And it would be very bad if I would see an API endpoint without any authentication to it. But you don't have to do a lot to get authentication to work if you are working with Azure Static Web Apps. Okay, identity, I'm not going to cover. It's simply, of course, how you manage things internally in Azure. Edge computing, we're not going to do. Hosting plans, well, I'll show you, and that's why it's easy, because now I can do it when it's not really running. I'll simply change it, save it, and in just a few seconds, you will see that my hosting plan got updated. So if I start out with a free plan, and once I start using it, I come up with, well, I do need the paid plan. It's easy. I can switch to it in just a few seconds. Okay, my private endpoints, don't need them at the moment, and logs, just things like the normal things, and tasks, not that. Automation task, well, yeah, you can work with some tasks here as well, and you could, for instance, send a monthly cost. Okay. So a lot you can do. Okay, given the time, I'm going to switch back to my presentation. Because if I look at what I have shown you, in my personal opinion, I think it's a very good deployment option if you are using Blazor WASM. Not if you're using Blazor Server, but if you're using Blazor WASM, it's a very good option. It comes with a good CI/CD option. It does provide you with a good API integration. There's automatic staging. What I didn't mention, but I do want to mention now, the API integration is great. But do keep in mind that the time frame you get from an Azure function is limited in the Azure Static Web App. So do not start running long-running processes in your API because that won't work. This is learning, and I'm an educator, so I have a call to action for you. This is a great combination, but you can only learn it by simply start experimenting with it. And I hope that I've shown you in this session that it's not that difficult, especially if you're using the Azure portal, especially if you're using the free plan. You can do a lot without that getting charged to your credit card. And if you have small projects on your own or things like that, it's quite a cheap option to start experimenting. And it's a lot cheaper than using a beefy app service for it. Yes, that will work, but you will pay a lot more. Okay. If you want to get in touch, you've got all kinds of information. I'm still on X. I am moving mostly to Blue Sky. I've got my blog. I've got my GitHub where you can also find this code, but all other kinds of codes as well. And I do have 2 YouTube channels. The first one is in Dutch, so probably difficult to understand. The other one's in English and with a broader range of topics. And I would say I'll simply open it up to questions if there are any, and I will simply stop sharing because then we can more easily interact and I can see the chat, so it will be a lot easier to do. So are there any questions?
I just want to say thank you very much for coming and presenting to us today. Very instructive talk. Learned a lot, and it was definitely more comprehensive as well. So it was not only the deployment into the static web apps, but actually what static web apps were, and then some of the gotchas, especially around some of the function integrations as well, which is quite useful. So I love the fact that you use the branch methodology as we discussed earlier as well. I did have a question, and it's more of a, why would you use Blazor, for example, versus React? Like, do you know the answer to that, or is it? It's just something I've always wondered. So
yeah, it's quite personal. Well, to be honest, I'm a C# developer, and I've developed C# since it came out in 1.0, and I really love C#, and I don't like JavaScript that much. That's the reason why I love Blazor. It's not that I can't do it. Yes, I've built things in Angular, I've built things in Vue, but I like C# a lot better than I do JavaScript.
Yeah.
And what I think is also quite nice for Blazor, especially if you have a development team coming from it, for instance, from ASP.NET Web Forms, it does provide them a good way to get away from web forms and into the more modern HTML world.
Yeah.
And they can still use the same skill set because they probably haven't had that much chance of getting familiar with JavaScript. So it's a better opportunity sometimes for them to migrate. So it's a personal preference.
I'm sure wars have been created over that very question, right? Why would you use one language over another? Yeah.
And it really, it's partly about skill sets. It's partly about what does a team feel comfortable with. If I join a team and they're entirely comfortable with working in React, or Angular, it's fine by me. I can make do in JavaScript frameworks as well. Of course, I've got my preference, and in a lot of side projects that I use Blazor simply because I love it. But it's always a biased choice that you make when you choose a server-side or a front-end framework.
It's the same with like infrastructure as code as well. Terraform versus Bicep. It's like, well, it depends. Not happy to do both, but it comes down to the skill sets who actually implementing it, and B, more importantly, who will be supporting it after. So I get it. I was just curious, but there's no questions in the chat. We had a couple of people leave midway who will watch the recording as well. So if you've got to this point and watched the recording, yeah, definitely reach out to Johan for any comments or questions. I'm sure he'll be happy to assist you with that. I love just watching
Definitely.
the demo as well. I had GitHub open to the side, and watching the actions run and watching the code get committed into the repository as well. So very live demo, really great. But yeah, thank you for coming and presenting.
You're more than
tonight,
welcome.
And donating your time to teach us all something new. So thank you very much.
More than happy to be hopefully an inspiration to start experimenting with this technology.
Cool. Definitely. Awesome. Thank you very much. Stopping the meeting, but thank you very much.